Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
The last few days in Syria have shocked the world.
Bashar Al-Assad has fled to Moscow after rebels advanced on Damascus.
It's truly unbelievable scenes. Most people alive today do not know a Middle East that did not have the Assad regime at the helm of Syria.
After 10 days of rebel advances across the country and a lightning offensive into Syria's capital over the weekend, Bashar al-Assad fled Damascus for Russia, ending his family's 50-year grip on power over Syria and his own brutal 24-year reign. His toppling creates a power vacuum in a country that's been ravaged by 13 years of a deadly civil war. Syrian rebels on Monday were in the process of appointing an interim government to replace Assad. But as global leaders react to the rapid shifts on the ground, the country and the region face an uncertain future.
It's certainly momentous. For the Middle East, it's hugely symbolic.
That's Bloomberg's Paul Wallace, who's been covering the fallout from Dubai. He joined me to break down the developments.
And talking to Syrians, whether they're in the country or whether they're in the diaspora somewhere, there's almost a universal sense of jubilation that finally the country is rid of the Assad regime, but that's mixed with a lot of nervousness and wariness about what comes next.
Today on the show, what the swift and unexpected toppling of Bashar al-Assad's regime means for Syria, the Middle East, and the world. This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. Paul, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'd love to catch up everyone on what's been a landmark few days in Syria. Can you walk us through what happened this past weekend?
Everything happened extremely quickly and in a way that took, I think, everyone off guard, not just Syrians, but world powers too, that have vested interests in the country. 2 weeks ago, Syria was in a civil war that started back in 2011, but the situation was pretty stable and the government of President Bashar Al-Assad seemingly had little to worry about. It didn't control all of the country. The country's kind of been a patchwork of areas controlled by different groups for a long time, groups ranging from Islamic State to the government itself to Kurdish groups and lots of other types of organizations in between. But suddenly in late November, a rebel group advanced out of a northwestern province that it controls called Idlib and took Aleppo. That was a major shock. But even then, people thought, wow, okay, they may try and advance on Damascus, the capital, but that would surely take a long time. And we went into the weekend with the rebels having advanced a little bit from Aleppo. But what happened was that the Syrian military just collapsed at an astonishingly quick rate. It gave up cities like Hama and then Homs, which was the last one before Damascus. And then Damascus was taken extremely quickly. Essentially, apart from Aleppo, those areas and those cities were given up by the Syrian military without a fight. And that just showed how hollowed out it had become and how hollowed out Syria's institutions had become after 13 years of civil war and almost a quarter of a century of rule under Bashar al-Assad.
Tell us a little more about the main rebel coalition that ultimately forced Assad from Syria. Who are they? What are their motivations? And who's leading that coalition?
So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a Sunni Islamist organization. It's the one that led the rebel advance. HTS, as it's called, broke away from Al-Qaeda in 2016. It claims to have moderated significantly since then, but it is still designated a terrorist organization by the US, the UK, and many other countries. It's led by someone who goes by two names. His real name, if you like, is Ahmed al-Shara. He's also got a nom de guerre or a war name, and that's Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. He is in his early 40s and spent time in Iraq fighting with militias there. But he was instrumental in setting up a civilian quasi-government, if you like, in the rebel-held territory of Idlib, where this latest uprising began. He has a pretty good reputation among Syrians that have either lived under HTS's rule or that have read and heard about him. But there's still a lot of wariness among Syrians and governments around the world that HTS has actually shed all of its most extreme parts of its ideology. And certainly there are still elements within the group that would be classified as extremist by most standards in the West.
Let's back up a bit more and give some more historical context. You mentioned this conflict dating back to 2011. What are some of the key events in the past decade or so that really led us to this moment?
Syria was one of the countries that was hardest hit by the Arab Spring that started in late 2010 and really kicked off in 2011 and saw Arab leaders in places like Yemen, in Egypt and Libya toppled. The Arab Spring essentially kicked off the civil war in Syria. And for the first probably 5 or so years, that was when the fighting was most intense. Early on, in about 2012, Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, the Iranian proxy militia, came to Bashar Al-Assad's aid, and they sent troops there around that time. Assad didn't really look all that vulnerable until about 2015, and at that stage, he probably was going to fall. And that's when Russia and Iran stepped in, and Iran doing so directly, not just through helping Hezbollah with arms and funding. And if it wasn't for Vladimir Putin and the Iranian government deciding to do that, he probably would have been ousted back in 2015. But they saved him. For Russia, this was a real power play. It was one of the in fact, the only time really that Russia has engaged so decisively outside its own direct sphere of influence in, say, Central Asia or Eastern Europe. And Putin used his ability to enable Assad to survive, not only to showcase his clout globally, but to use it to try and drive a wedge between the various Western powers and also between other Arab states and Western powers.
When we come back, how developments in Syria could impact the rest of the Middle East and the region's ongoing geopolitical conflicts. Syria sits at the geographic center of several powers in the Middle East. One of its neighbors, Israel, has been at war with Iran's proxies in the area, Hamas and Hezbollah. And over the weekend, as Assad's regime fell, the Israeli military made incursions into its buffer zone with Syria and reportedly launched strikes on military targets, including on suspected chemical weapon sites. Bloomberg's Paul Wallace told me Israel is just one of the major players trying to get a handle on what a post-Assad Syria could look like. Paul, the Middle East is grappling with a web of overlapping conflicts right now. What does this development in Syria mean for the region broadly?
If you look at Syria in terms of the size of its population or its commodity exports or its economy in general, it's not that significant on a global scale, but it is one of the Middle East's larger countries. It holds a strategic position. It borders Israel, it borders Lebanon, it borders Turkey. It's got part of the Mediterranean coast. And Syria has traditionally been very much one of the heartlands of the Arab world. It's important to note that while Bashar al-Assad has ruled since 2000, his father, Hafez, ruled since the 1970s, and essentially it's been family rule for almost 55 years until last weekend. They were both, in the end, as despotic, as autocratic and as despised as each other. So for the Middle East, it's hugely symbolic. And talking to Syrians, whether they're in the country or whether they're in the diaspora somewhere, there's almost a universal sense of jubilation that finally the country is rid of the Assad regime. But that's mixed with a lot of nervousness and wariness about what comes next. In terms of what's been going on in the Middle East recently, of course, I think a lot of listeners will be thinking, how does this tie with Israel's conflicts with Hezbollah in Lebanon and with Hamas in Gaza? And depending on how you see it, it could be seen as a continuation of that. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that if Israel hadn't weakened Hezbollah so much in the last 2 or 3 months, things would have been very different in Syria. And I think He's alluding to the fact that maybe Hezbollah would have been able to send troops from Lebanon into neighboring Syria if it wasn't so weakened by war with Israel. I don't think we can say it was down to Israel. It was certainly down to opposition forces and Syrians themselves, but it's not completely isolated from what's been going on in the region since October last year.
What about Russia and Iran, countries with ties to Assad? How have they been reacting?
They, I think, are the two big losers from what's happened. It's hard to overstate just how crucial Assad was, both to Iran's government and Russia's Vladimir Putin. He was absolutely key to their influence in the Middle East. Russia has its only Mediterranean naval base in Syria. It has a nearby air base there, and President-elect Donald Trump actually said as much, and he and many others have said that this is a sign of how distracted and weakened Russia has been by its war in Ukraine and how weakened Iran has been by conflict with Israel, either directly or via its proxies like Hezbollah over the last year.
Speaking of President-elect Trump, what is the U.S.'s positioning in all of this? What do we know about how Trump might approach Syria and developments there as he enters office next month?
I think for the US, it's a very tricky situation. Essentially, Joe Biden's administration and Donald Trump are taking the same view. They're essentially saying that step back. We can't do anything at the moment. Just let events in Syria unfold. We shouldn't get involved. Trump said that very unambiguously. He said it's their fight. Whatever happens, the US should just stay out of it. The White House under Biden has not been as explicit, but its actions point to it thinking in much the same way. The Americans have troops in Syria. On paper, they're there to help fight ISIS and other extremist groups. There's not a huge number of troops there, but I imagine what the US is going to do for the rest of Biden's term and probably for the early part of Trump's presidency is just to stay back and wait till the situation stabilizes.
The long-term leadership of Syria is unclear right now, but what do we know so far about who is in power in Syria today and who might take over long-term?
That's a good question, and that's a very big question. HTS controls Damascus, the capital, and Aleppo, the second city in Syria, and other cities in between them. So essentially, it controls areas containing the vast bulk of Syria's population. Other groups, some of which are supported by Turkey, some of which are opposed by Turkey, control bits of northern Syria. You still got Islamic State in control of small parts of, let's say, very largely populated parts of eastern Syria, and groups in between. At the moment, I think you would say that HTS is in charge since it has the capital and the second city as well, but that's far from saying that it's consolidated its grip across the country.
And Paul, what does this all mean for the people of Syria, millions of whom have been displaced, hundreds of thousands of whom have been killed in this 13-year-long civil war? What could the immediate future look like on the ground for them?
I think the first thing is that it essentially means the war is over. As you mentioned, this war has been absolutely devastating by global standards, by historical standards, you name it. UN agencies estimate that somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people have been killed by fighting or by disease and other effects of war. Close to 15 million people have been displaced. And there is still fighting in some parts of Syria, so it's not totally peaceful yet. But broadly speaking, I think HTS's toppling of Assad brings the civil war to an end. And that is first and foremost the biggest source of relief for Syrians. And I think now it's a case of, can the country unite? Can it build up its economy, which has been absolutely devastated in the last 13 years? I think the first thing they'll be looking for is for somebody, whether it's HTS or somebody else, to actually consolidate their grip on the country and to form a proper functioning and inclusive government.
This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by Julia Press and Jessica Beck. It was edited by Aaron Edwards and Greg White. It was fact-checked by Adriana Tapia and mixed and sound designed by Alex Sugiura. Our senior producer is Naomi Shavin. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Our executive producer is Nicole Beamsterboer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.